have is we have a joint review of and concurrence by the water board of both the Central Valley or whatever water board it is appropriate and the state board on is there protected water and do they need a groundwater plan and is that groundwater plan accurate? Okay. But that's the interim regs because we don't yet have the criteria.
Okay. I think that's important to recognize as far as the whole process and the information we're requesting. Thanks.
Right. So we have provided water board staff with recommendations for what should be included in a groundwater monitoring plan submitted by the operator to satisfy the requirement that they monitor any new well stimulation activity. We are calling that area specific and not well by well in a for the reasons that Jonathan mentioned, that a densely drilled field may have a number of closely spaced wells, and they may not each require an individual monitoring well. So we're referring to it as area specific or area wide monitoring. The first kind of decision is what groundwater should be monitored. And our recommendation will be that all water up to 10,000 ppm be considered for monitoring if it meets the criteria that it contains less than 10,000 ppm TDS, if there is sufficient quantity of water in the aquifer for beneficial use, not just for public drinking water supply, but for agriculture, for other beneficial use, and if it's not been excluded from the requirement to submit a groundwater monitoring plan. So, the operators can apply for an exclusion on the basis of the presence of hydrocarbons, contaminations, some other criteria. The rationale is fairly simple. We are in the midst of a historic drought. You're dealing with that in real time. Any water with the potential for beneficial use should be protected, and that's what these recommendations would do. We also know that it's technically feasible to desalinate brackish groundwater. There's more than a dozen brackish groundwater treatment plants that are either in operation or will be in operation soon. Kind of a corollary to this is that if we do make this recommendation, then we need to know more about the distribution of this kind of usable groundwater in the state. We know quite a bit about the distribution of groundwater with less than 3,000 ppm. This is the groundwater that is used by agriculture and by municipalities. We know far less about the distribution of usable groundwater with TDS between 3,000 and 10,000 TDS. And so our recommendations is that operator-submitted groundwater monitor plans should include data relevant to determining aquifer salinity. This shouldn't be an issue. They already do. And that the state, and this could be Dogger, this could be the water board or a combination, should systematically determine the spatial and vertical distribution of usable groundwater in all basins containing oil and gas fields. We did consider contaminant pathways. Preston talked about these. Some of the most significant pathways are how produced water or wastewater is disposed of, either through discharge to unlined sumps or through injection, and when it's injection to non-exempt aquifers, that becomes an issue. And then hydrofracturing itself and natural fractures and faults are other pathways. Much of the Dogger regulation is built around zonal isolation and making sure that the hydrofractures stay within zone. Another significant potential pathway, and I'll emphasize potential for the reasons that Preston cited, are wells, and both the stimulation well, but also inactive, active, or abandoned wells that are in close proximity to the stimulation well. These are of concern, especially during the hydrofracture event. The Dogger
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I know that's an issue that, we're encountering in Superfund sites and other places where wells aren't abandoned properly. Do you have any sense of the magnitude here?
Yeah.
I'll have a slide with well density later, but I think the answer is we don't know.
I mean, I can't say that I've looked at that for steam blowouts, which again is an extreme event, and the rate at which a well will blow out when it's encountered by steam is about 1 out of 5,000 to 1 out of 10,000. So, that's not the total answer, but in terms of a really extreme leakage event, those are the numbers. Something you can think that's high or low. That's a subjective decision, but that's the frequency that we've seen.
The Dogger regulation recognizes that well bores and geologic features are potential pathways, and requires the operators to identify well bores and geologic features that are within a certain distance of the stimulated well. They use a concept of axial dimensional stimulation area. This is actually a volume. It has a height, a width, and an azimuth. Our recommendation will be to use a conservative approach to this, to assume, Preston showed you the bi-winged fractures that are common in gel-based California well stimulation. That could result in a very thin, narrow axial dimensional stimulation area. We're recommending a cylinder unless there's field data that is provided to support a smaller ADSA. And we're also recommending that groundwater monitoring always be required when there are well bores present within a buffer zone of the stimulated well. We're recommending monitoring of protected groundwater with less than 10,000 ppm. We are recommending that 2 wells be placed down gradient of the stimulated well, and that all aquifers that contain protected groundwater be monitored individually. So if you have a shallow protected alluvial aquifer and then you have a bedrock aquifer, those would need either separate monitoring wells or a multi-level monitoring system. We're also recommending the use of guard wells if there are water supply wells present within a kilometer. And like I said, if you have a densely drilled field, you may be able to put in a line of monitor wells in which some of these monitor wells are monitoring more than one stimulated well. And in one scenario, area monitoring may not be required. And that is when, all 3 of these criteria apply. There's no groundwater with less than 3,000 ppm. There are no vertical conduits within 2 ADSA. And there is a regional monitoring well present within a mile of that well. So it is a little bit of a tiered approach. In terms of the analytes, we've provided a list. It includes the analytes that are on the interim regulation that Jonathan was talking about. We're recommending methane and methane isotopic composition be monitored. Guar gum sugars, this is a fairly simple, inexpensive analysis, and guar is used in large quantity in gel-based hydrofracture. And then we are also recommending that 2 chemical additives chosen on the mass used in the stimulation and on their persistence in the environment be monitored. We don't necessarily expect to see these, but a large part of this program is to kind of allay the public's concerns about well stimulation. So, and then there's, like Preston said, there's a large number of other constituents. We are not requiring or recommending that these be monitored except if there is some evidence for impact or for a change in water quality. As in all monitoring programs, it is important to establish a baseline and to establish a metric for detecting a change in water quality. We're going to allow we're recommending allowing the producers to recommend a method, but we make a specific recommendation to use the RCRA approach as outlined in this fairly comprehensive document. And we make a specific recommendation on which method to use. But, you know, if there are other methods the producers want to recommend that, we would allow that. So those are kind of the highlights from the area specific or area-wide monitoring. The regional monitoring, Dr. Taylor is going to talk about, so I'm not going to say a whole lot. The most recent version of their plan includes 3 tasks. One is to detect transport of fluids out of isolated production zones to protected groundwater. This doesn't distinguish between well stimulation, enhanced oil recovery, or underground injection. It will require mapping of protected groundwater resources. And, you know, in most instances, we have models for shallow aquifers that we use. We have good models for the oil reservoirs. We don't have models that link them. So understanding that transport is going to be important. Monitoring impact of sumps on shallow groundwater. The regional boards are already starting to do this. So, you know, whatever this program does has to be value added. And then finally, investigating the impact of wellbore integrity on water quality. And that's going to require a little bit more thought. I'm just going to make a couple of statements. One is that we do concur that the regional program should monitor the impact of all oil and gas development on groundwater quality. And the reasons for that are first, the pathways of most concern are not necessarily well stimulation. They're disposal of produced waters, either through injection or through discharge to unlined sumps, and then well integrity failure. You know, another is that a primary concern is the salinity and natural constituents in produced fluids, and not necessarily the well stimulation chemical additives, which are going to be diluted, and only under certain circumstances are we going to be able to see those. And then finally, those chemicals that are used in well stimulation are not unique to well stimulation. Toxic compounds like biocides, some of the surfactants are also used in other oil and gas operations, so they're not unique to well stimulation. In terms of monitoring for regional water quality, you know, we want to be able to integrate the data sets or compare the data sets. So, you know, whatever is monitored by the regional program should include all the analytes that are monitored in the area-wide program. You know, the understanding transport will be an important part of the regional program. So there are naturally occurring compounds and tracers in these waters that can tell you something about source and transport. So select samples should be monitored for those and for toxic and indicator compounds. And then I think it's important that the regional monitoring program have access to samples collected from the other programs, because they'll be analyzing analytes that are not analyzed in those programs, and they're going to need to establish signatures and end members, and so they'll need access to those samples. And then finally, my last slide, you know, we are really leading the nation in the regulation of well stimulation, you know, full disclosure of chemical additives, systematic groundwater monitoring of new well stimulation projects, regional groundwater monitoring. These are all fairly new. It's going to take some time to bring this program up to speed and to figure out how to do this, because monitoring a deep subsurface source is you know, is fundamentally different than monitoring a surface source. We don't know a lot about the hydrogeology and permeability of strata between production zones and groundwater zones. You know, we don't know much about the distribution of brackish groundwater. There is available data out there, but it needs to be compiled and digitized. And monitoring strategies are, you know, we're going to be monitoring deeper. It's going to take a while to figure out what monitoring strategies work and what don't work. So, you know, the kind of the bottom line is some time is going to be required to implement a long-term regional monitoring plan.
Now, when you say monitoring a deep subsurface, but we're hearing that we're really not dealing with necessarily deep. it's, some
Well,
of
we
it's
are
fairly
deeper.
shallow.
Right, but we're deeper than most of the monitoring that we're currently doing, which is in
Okay,
shallow
so
groundwater
that,
aquifers.
maybe that would be clearer to just say monitoring subsurface sources below current monitoring
Yeah.
standards or something like that, because
Mm.
so we're consistent.
Right.
So I think we've got, Kevin, are you going to be talking next? Yes, and so now we're going to switch to the regional monitoring. So we've done the well by well in the area, then we'll have the regional. Then there'll be an opportunity for public comment and for any questions or comments that you have before we go on to our a short staff report of where we are in the status. Is that, well, we're not going to really talk about what we're thinking because we're just seeing this today. This report is, well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Chair Marcus, members of the board, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. We have had the pleasure of working with your staff on the GAMMA program and now on the oil and gas program for some time. And my talk is going to focus on the regional program and basically how we are getting our arms around what that might mean and some suggestions for you to consider as you move forward. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Geological Survey, we're a federal science agency. We have no regulatory or management responsibilities. Our role is to provide impartial information to the public and specifically to the agencies who do have regulatory and management authority and responsibility. We've been working, we have an office in every single state, and we've been working here in California with collaborators since I think 1893. So we appreciate the opportunity to continue that tradition. We have a core team who's been working on this. We have people in California, Colorado, and Connecticut at the moment, and we pull in more as we need more expertise. The core team, Matt Landon, Miranda Fram, Justin Kulangoski, Pete McMahon, Claudia Font, and myself at the end. So we started talking with staff about, well, how do we frame this problem of monitoring well stimulation from oil and gas wells? And we started with some really basic questions. Okay, where's the water? Let's not start with oil. Let's start with where's the water? And then what does it already have in it? Where's well stimulation occurring? And then what mechanisms might link well stimulation to where the water is? And then we can think about how are we going to monitor those mechanisms to make sure that there is no further degradation of the water. So that's kind of our starting point. And you know, I feel like Preston and Brad have given my talk already, but I will say things from maybe another perspective. There is no systematic information about where water is, especially water containing over 3,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids. The maps that we do have use inconsistent criteria for determining what the 3,000 milligrams per liter is. They're estimates. They're using terms called base of fresh water. It's all over the map. So it could be anywhere from 10,000 to 4,000 milligrams per liter is called fresh.
Now, is that because when you say the information we have, are you talking about the information USGS has and we have through GAMMA, or are you just talking about the compilation of whatever data anybody's collected for whatever reason?
Our information is much more precise, but we don't go into those areas where the oil fields are to that extent. So when Dogger and the oil companies have gone in trying to figure out where the fresh water is, the criteria that they've used to define that is inconsistent. And like Brad said, there's virtually no information on the aquifers containing between 3,000 and 10,000 TDS. And we also recognize that current and future beneficial uses may not fit these categories very neatly anymore. we're in a drought. I'm sure you're well aware of that. I know, you keep saying it, right? I see it on the freeway signs. But these are kind of, goalposts out there that we can use for measurement. So we wanted to map out, where's the water? This is a statewide map, and the blue shows you the density of domestic wells. To find those domestic wells, we have access to the DWR driller's logs, and we did statistical sampling, so we can tell you how many domestic wells there are in each township and range section across the entire state. So this map, the darker blue represents higher density, and the white means virtually none. And you can see that there's high densities of domestic wells in the foothill areas, in the Sonoma-Napa area, in Monterey, and in the Fresno, Madera, Bakersfield area. I'm just kind of pointing out a couple of dense areas. The second thing you see on this slide are the red and yellow dots. Those are oil wells. And the red dots are the information we have from Dogger about those wells that have been hydraulically fractured. And the yellow dots are all other wells, projection wells, injection wells, idle wells. And the colors here, so if you see pure yellow or pure red, those are oil wells where there's no water. The blue overlay changes the color. So anything that's not pure yellow or red, there's wells, water wells in the same township range section as those oil wells. So we also wanted to say, okay, let's drill down and get some better data. And over the course of the last year, we've gone back and looked at all well logs that DWR has in its library that are within 1 mile of all oil and gas fields in the state. There's roughly 40,000 of them. We went in and we looked at the data. We saw how deep they were, how old they were, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have all wells from that sample: domestic, municipal, irrigation, industrial wells. And this is that data set plotted out for Kern County. Same deal with the colors. Denser, darker blue is a denser number of wells per section. And you can see that there are not many pure yellow or red dots. Again, same issue. Caveat on this data, we found out that there's a bunch of paper records that have not yet been scanned for Kern County. So the DWR library only contains about half of the paper records in it. So we only got about half the well records, and we don't know how that might change distribution. The other caveat is that there's also a time lag between the well drilling and the time that DWR gets the well information. So this new spate of well drilling that's been going on to get more water are probably going to be in deeper and less pure water, fresh water zones. So we could see an expansion of these, the blue to more areas, but we just don't know yet. So we asked the question, we asked the question, where's the water? And now we ask the question, so what's the potential risk for well stimulation to overall water quality? And for that, we've relied pretty heavily on our friends at LBL and their team at CCST, because they did that portion of the work. And so we took a step back and we asked, okay, so what's going on in the rest of the world that well stimulation takes place in? And well stimulation is taking place in a very, very long history of oil and gas development in California. It's been going on since the 1800s. And in the initial phase of that history, you drill an oil well, it'll be pressured, you get the oil out, it's easy. Around the 1950s, excuse me? Like in the movies, exactly, like in the Beverly Hillbillies. Around the 1950s, that easy resource was tapped out, and they started to use other methods. They would insert heaters down at the bottom of wells. They would light underground fires. They'd inject surfactants, polymers, do all kinds of things to get the oil out. And today, the dominant so-called enhanced recovery process is injecting water or steam into these areas. And there's two basic injection processes. Either you drill a whole bunch of wells that are all injection wells and you produce through a couple, or you do what they call huff and puff, which is you inject steam, it warms everything up, and then you pump it back up out of the same well. So those are the methods that are going on. Let me catch up with myself here. So what this suggests to us is also, we know from WSPA that there's been well stimulation in these oil fields since the 1950s. That we don't have a clean background. We have an exceptionally managed system that's been worked over and worked over and worked over for decades. And that it is going to be exceptionally hard to isolate that small, new element of well stimulation from everything else. So you were asking about flows and fluids. We kind of looked at the same thing from another slightly different perspective. And this slide shows you an aggregate of flows that are reported for all oil fields in the entire state. And we took, what is it, a 30, 40-year period here. And you can see that the highest volume is the produced water, stuff coming up out of the wells as you're producing the oil. The next highest volume is that's injected for enhanced recovery. This is the water and steam injections. Most of the water that's used, that's injected for enhanced recovery, is recycled. It comes from the produced water flows, and it's treated. Sometimes you have the additives, like the biocides or surfactants or whatever, and then you pump it right back in. So there's a lot of cycling going on within these fields. The third highest flow is the waste disposal through underground injection control wells. And then there's a difference. So we kind of said, well, what's the difference? And really, really rough figures, this is about the same magnitude of water that Chevron, who has fairly fresh produced water, sends to the irrigation district after treatment. And the irrigation district mixes it, if needed, to come into compliance with standards before it's applied to the ag fields. A warning about this slide, we cannot close the mass balance because we do not have all of the data from all the fields about their water use. There's other water use, like cooling for power plants on site. Some fields will import water for use in hydraulic fracking operations. Some will discharge to municipal sewer systems. So there's a lot of unknowns, so consider this kind of like a rule of thumb. But you look at this, the big dogs, as we call them, are the produced water and the stuff injected for enhanced recovery and what's injected for waste disposal on a statewide aggregate. So I think one of our core conclusions was pretty early on that the well stimulation risks by themselves to groundwater quality at large are going to be small compared to the other risks associated with all other oil and gas activities. And I think you've heard that from both Preston and Brad. And so we talked with staff, we said, okay, what do you want us to do? And so we basically have a conceptual model of how to look at monitoring the risks that oil and gas development at writ large poses to groundwater quality. And that model has 3 different components. Let me, sometimes your computers don't work the way you want them to. Okay, the first component is really focused on zonal isolation. A lot of oil and gas activities take place within isolated zones that there's fairly low risk of movement between those zones towards usable groundwater. Some don't, but we don't necessarily know what's isolated and what's not. And I think that one of the things that you've seen recently in the underground injection program is a lot of questions being raised about the process that they went through to figure out whether the injection zones were in fact isolated or not. They have a very, very systematic way of looking exactly what's happening at each well But on the whole, on how these aquifers connect, I'm not sure that anybody really knows. And just to show you a slide that illustrates kind of that question, we've been partnered up with the Sacramento State folks, and this slide is from Ed Triggerboff and Dave Shimabukuro, and it's simple mapping of the volumes of fluid injected into these waste wells. And in some cases it's fairly small, but in other cases it can be fairly large. And these volumes are mapped over the lifetime of a well. There's like 30, 35 years for some of them, but you can see the biggest circles are 10,000 barrels, which is 10 million barrels, I'm sorry, 42 million gallons. So there's some waste injection wells where you have 42 million gallons that have been pumped into them over a 30-year period. And so from our perspective, that's a much larger fluid flow than 150,000 gallons from a well stimulation event. But not all of these dots have nearly that high of a flow. So it's not everywhere it's going to be site specific. The second kind of pathway of concern and monitoring component we think would suggest would be around surface activities. These have regulatory systems in place. You are well aware of what Region 5 is doing to work on the sumps. And we feel, like Brad said, that any regional monitoring program needs to bring added value to this. And one idea we had was that we could do a gamma-style study. And what that is we basically would draw a box to represent the shallow aquifer in areas where there's a lot of history of surface activities from oil and gas. It can be, spreading oil on roads. It can be these sumps. It can be pipelines. It can be oil field, whatever. And in that box, we use a gamma-style sampling strategy where we map out all the existing wells. We take a statistical sample, and then we can tell what portion of the aquifer in that box has what kind of water quality. And that would tell you what the historic impact of oil and gas activities, surface activities, have been on that particular resource. The third pathway of concern, you've heard a lot from Preston and Brad again already, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. But as in other places in the country, we expect that wellbore flow, well integrity, are going to prove to be a major source of constituent transport between these isolated zones and potentially usable groundwaters. If you don't have cement, outside of the pipe, between the pipe and the rock, you can get flows along the outside of the pipe. If you've got breaks in the pipe, you can get stuff from the pipe leaking outside. You can have shear, where you have situations like in the diatomite collapses really easily and the wells shear off. And they shear off at a specific place in the geology. So you've got a lot of wells shearing off. You have land subsidence because of groundwater withdrawal that can make these wells vulnerable. And just to show you why we think this is probably an emerging problem, there's a very high density of these wells in oil fields in California. This is the Kern River oil field, and so 31 of the 168 currently active fields that are bigger than 2 miles, 31 contain more than 100 known well bores per square mile. And that's a fairly high density, and we know that the material degrades over time. And you're asking about, the history of improperly abandoned wells. They range from everything where everything's perfect to, wells that are filled with mud, capped with a redwood plug, and then handed to a water district because they didn't have any oil in them. So we found the whole gamut. Yeah. So again, these are kind of conceptual suggestions that we're making to staff, that the regional monitoring program have these 3 kind of core tasks. And our suggestion is that, well integrity is probably going to turn out to be a major issue in the future. But to figure out what it is, we're going to have to do these other things first, because it's going to be really hard to find a lot of little leaks and figure out where they came from. And that zonal isolation is really the place where the greatest risk is for future water quality degradation. So I want to shift over to summarize some of the work that we've been doing over the past year with your team. One is we've been working to try and, like, there's 400 some odd oil and gas wells out there. That's a huge number. We've been trying to get a handle on how would you prioritize work across that range of oil fields. We've been looking very specifically at the detail of 2 oil fields to kind of think through the processes about how you would figure out where to monitor and when, why. And then we've also been doing some exploratory sampling of water wells and produced water to test our geochemical methods and work with our labs and see what kind of flow through they can handle. So let me start with the vulnerability assessment. We're starting with proximity as a really, really first cut. The closer the water is to the oil, the higher the risk. Now, that's not always true, because you could have, like, a barrier, and there could be stuff with a lot of separation, but lots of leaks. But this is our first cut, and it's a planning level analysis. So let me give you an example about why we're doing this. We heard early on that there's a lot of separation, no issues. So we said, well, is that always true? And we looked at 2 fields in particular. We looked at the Rose oil field, which is in kind of the middle portion of the southern San Joaquin Valley, and the Kern River oil field, which is sort of in the foothills there, just north of Bakersfield. And what this map is, it's a distribution of well depths. And if you think of like a normal curve, and then you kind of squash it on its side, that's what these boxes and lines and dots represent. So the middle of the box is like the middle of the hat. On the left is the Kern River oil field, and this is an oil field with very fresh produced water, unusual. And you can see the red boxes show the depth of the oil and gas extraction wells. And the middle of the box is kind of like the dense distribution, and then you can see it go off to those bars, and then the tails are those individual dots at the top and at the bottom. So you can see that, the average depth is about 1,500 feet for the oil and gas extraction wells. The other thing we wanted to look at is we wanted to look at the top of the waste injection wells, because they're probably that's where you're interested in seeing how close that is to the groundwater. And again, the top of the waste injection wells is about, 1,600. And then the blue wells are water wells. You can see the average depth is probably, 400 feet. But what's interesting in Kern are the tails, because you can see that there's oil and gas extraction wells that go all the way up to the surface, and they're right in the same depth zone as the water wells. The water wells are going deeper. They go down into this main zone where the waste is being injected, same depth zone. So there's a lot of overlap in Kern River. The Rose oil field, however, is a completely different story. Yeah, the Rose oil field, the oil and gas is at 8,000 feet. The fracking is taking place at that depth. You'll notice there's a significant difference between the waste injection wells, which are shallower because it's cheaper to inject waste at shallower depths than it is deeper depths. Waste injection, 3,000 to 4,000 feet. And the water wells are, up there between, 300 and 1,000 feet. So if you were just looking at proximity, you would say Rose is probably low priority, but Kern River is an area that needs to be looked at more. So one of our products that we are going to be delivering soon, and we want to work with staff to figure exactly how to make this work, is we want to produce some statewide proximity mapping. And let me tell you a little bit about some of the data sources for this. We were fortunate to receive a complete set of 20,000 data for 20,000 injection wells from Dogger, thanks to them, from their database. And we also used those 40,000 water well logs that we digitized from DWR. And the information from the injection wells told us the value Dogger has for the base of fresh water, where you think it's about 3,000 TDS. The water wells, we have the depth to the deepest part of the screens. And we said, okay, there's different ways to bin the information between small separation, intermediate, and large, and that's one of the things we want to work with staff on to figure out what the right bins are. So, but this is an example of the maps that we will be producing for planning purposes to help figure out and prioritize fields. The other thing that we've been doing is looking specifically at a couple oil fields and figuring out where the data gaps are with respect to salinity. We are completely in concurrence that a three-dimensional map showing the distribution of the aquifers and where the water is that has these three characteristics would be really helpful for a lot of just reasons that help you figure out where to monitor. And so in Wilmington, for example, that's the field on the left. The total dissolved solids concentration is on the x-axis across the top, and the depth is below land surface is on the y-axis on the left. And you can see that the produced waters are fairly high salinities. They're, I don't know, roughly around 30,000 milligrams per liter at depths from 2,000 all the way down to 6,000 feet. The groundwater monitoring data runs from fresh to, about the same concentration as the produced waters. And, what you see in Wilmington is there's not much depth separation between fresh groundwater, which is in the 1,000 TDS range, but kind of getting close to that 2,000 foot depth, and the top of the produced water, which is much saltier and it's kind of creeping over that 2,000 feet deep. So there's not much depth separation there. And you can also see where exactly our data gaps are. It's in that 2,000 to 3,000 zone, 3,000 foot zone. The Santa Maria Valley is a different story, much more concentrated dots of the groundwater around 1,000, and nothing's really below 1,000 feet. The produced water is all below 4,000 feet. So in this case, we'd say Wilmington is a higher priority, and that we'd also say that there's a greater gap of knowledge in Santa Maria. Anything between 1,000 and 4,000 feet, we don't know anything about. So one of the things we looked at well, how do we fill those data gaps without, drilling 10,000 wells? And one of the things that we can use is we can use some geophysical data from boreholes, be they water wells or be they oil wells. They have these electrical logs in them, and our Connecticut team is running statistical analyses for boreholes data that we have for a couple specific oil fields in LA. And we're using LA because we have a lot of water chemistry, geology data, so we can calibrate those statistical runs. And so we hope to be able to use this technique to fill in those data gaps before any, actual field work would be required. The second task that we've been working on with staff is a really detailed field characterization pilot, and the purpose is really to work through the gory details of how do you put all these pieces together, what do you need, what's it going to look like. We chose two fields specifically for in Los Angeles for some reasons. We looked at Santa Fe Springs and Montebello. We knew that LA has a lot of oil fields. There's also a lot of active groundwater management and groundwater use. But more importantly, I think, is we had a lot of data. We had a lot of extensive information that we could use. We didn't have to create the data from scratch to be able to go through these analyses. And the characterization includes a long list that I kind of will walk through a little bit. First thing we did is we have a three-dimensional geologic model that extends from the surface all the way down into the top of the oil and gas producing areas. So we know what it looks like. and that was put together by Dan Ponte of the USGS and just recently published. And you can see in Santa Fe Springs, there's that dark portion that kind of peaks up in the middle of that corner there. That's oil bearing, and it actually comes to towards the surface. So you can see that you can have averages across the field, but they're not going to represent marginal risks. What we want to add to this visualization is information about the wells, all the wells, the water wells, the injection wells, the producing wells. We want to determine the fresh and saline groundwater distribution in this area. And we also want to map the exempted aquifers. And the resulting picture will look something like this. And we're aware that Dogger's in the process of developing the three-dimensional maps of the exempted aquifers, and we hope to be able to use that information. We might be refining it a little bit.
Will you also be looking at the wells that have been abandoned?
Yes.
Okay.
When we say wells, we mean all wells. Abandoned wells, producing wells. And one of our operating hypotheses is like we're going to see more chemical signatures in areas with older wells. So this is just a really cool, picture that sort of tells you what we're trying to put together. And I think the watchword for all this is it has to be site-specific. In some words, gamma is really easy. We had existing wells. We knew where the aquifers were. It was a sampling logistical problem. And we have to build these models to figure out where to sample. And because drilling wells is pretty expensive.
Will you be discussing your time frame?
I think that we should, I can tell you some of the parts of the time frame that will be the constraints. And I'll tell you right now, the oil companies have a lot of subsurface information. They have these visual models. They have subsurface flow models. And it would make our process much easier if we were able to access those as opposed to having to recreate them ourselves. They're confidential, we understand that, and so developing that process. The other thing is that we have to review it. We have to do peer reviews of them. So we'd have to dig in to see that we're comfortable with the data that we're using. The second real key piece with respect to time is wells. Because in a lot of these areas, especially in the southwest San Joaquin, there are not water wells where we can easily sample. And we'd either need access to idle oil and gas wells, and we'd need a process to figure out that we can use those oil and gas wells to sample for oil and gas constituents without getting contamination.
Like Hubble telescope underground.
Exactly.
This is just a great, oh, sorry, I want this graphic. This is yours, USGS. Do I have permission to blow it up?
You have permission to load it. I'm not sure where it came from. Yeah, I'll figure it out so you have the right
cool.
attribution for this. I don't want to.
Don't you love LA?
So I said the other thing that's going to constrain us is well drilling. It takes we can probably drill about 4 wells, multi-level completion wells, down to 3,000 feet a year. And each of those wells is probably going to take between 500 and 500,000 to 1.5 million. So.
And there aren't existing wells that you could use?
Oh, whenever we can use existing wells, believe me, we will. But one of the things that we're running into is especially in the southwest part of the San Joaquin, is there's not the well density. And the other thing that we're interested in is we want to catch stuff flowing out of the isolated zones. And as we've said, we don't know much about what's the space, the intervening space is in there. So you just don't want to put a well anywhere. They're prime things to use. So those are our two major time constraints. But we'll talk once you decide what your regional monitoring program looks like. I think we'll be better able to give you some time frames for different elements of it. But we certainly recognize that you'd want, you'd want some things on a shorter turnaround, like this three-dimensional 3D map statewide. That we could probably put that one together much easier than we could go through some of these gory details per well field. Talk a little bit about analytical constituents. One of the things that we think is really important is to use a full suite. These compounds react differently, they move differently, they transport differently in the environment. And I think what we're dealing with is a situation where the oil fields all have different geochemistries. You put stuff into the ground and it can change before it comes back out of the ground. And chemistry is going to change over time. So if you think about these oil fields as a place where they're cycling everything, they're mixing water, they're taking in fresh water, they're adding additives, stuff is coming out. You're injecting oxygen into the system. So we would strongly recommend sticking with a full suite and doing less sampling in lower priority areas and denser monitoring in higher priority areas, and use that as a way to kind of prioritize. I do want to emphasize that there is no single compound or group of compounds that's going to be a silver bullet tracer. And let me explain to you how we're going to use these analyses. We're using what we call a geochemical end-member mixing model, which is basically we go out and these circles and boxes are what we would call the end members. So if we had samples from each of these circles and boxes, then whenever we went anywhere else in there and drilled a well or got a groundwater sample, we would be able to tell you exactly what sources combined to give you what we see in that particular sample. So we'd be able to tell you how much constituents associated with natural diffusion from oil and gas fields were there compared with constituents that came through what we call short circuits, leaking wells or underground injection wells, for example. So the other thing is that gases and isotopes are going to be very important for this work because they're really what's going to help us differentiate between the natural diffusion and these man-made short circuits. And like Brad said, I appreciate it that it's going to be important for us to have access to sample splits from these different sources. We've already talked to Clay, and I think what we'll end up is we'll have a library of end member samples such that the regional boards, if they have a site that they're working on, can use that and the end member mixing model to figure out where things came from. We've been applying these analytical constituents. We've running them for some exploratory sampling that we've done in the Los Angeles area and in Kern County. We are getting the data back and we're still chewing on it. So we expect a report ready for peer review in August or September. So I'm not going to state any conclusions from any of that sampling yet. But we designed it for a methodological test. Other places in the country, we know that you can differentiate between things that are affected by oil and gas and things that aren't with these different kinds of geochemical tests. We wanted to see if that was true in California. We wanted to test our labs, see what kind of data quality they had, what kind of throughput they had. So the results that I'm going to show you, we cannot tell you whether it's natural diffusion or whether it's short circuit. So just caveat.